Exploring the bizarre. Your e-ticket ride into the world of the paranormal. Strap yourself in as we traverse the universe exploring the unexplained. UFOs, ghosts, lost worlds, cryptozoology, as well as other dimensions. It's time to take back the night. Now, your electrifying hosts of Exploring the Bizarre, Timothy Beckley and Tim Swartz.
Well, why don't you tell us, Tim, who we have tonight?
Oh, with pleasure. Our guest tonight is Robert Schneck, and Robert is, gosh, I mean, he has written all kinds of fantastic books. President's Vampire. I think is your latest one, Robert, The Bye-Bye Man?
No, the latest book is Mrs. Wakeman versus the Antichrist.
Oh, okay. I was thinking that came out a little earlier than that.
The President's Vampire is being re-released as The Bye-Bye Man because one of the stories is being made into is coming out as a movie this year.
Well, it's coming
that's
now.
Fantastic, yeah.
That's and it was like what Dimension Films or something, which is
I'll be honest.
A really large.
I'll be honest with you. I can't figure out who exactly made the movie. There's STX and Hua Yin and a bunch of other people. I know who's in the movie, but I can't tell you exactly what company is responsible for it.
And any big names in the movie?
Oh, well, yeah. Doug Jones is playing the Bye-Bye Man. He's famous for playing the Pale Man in Pan's Labyrinth. And the gentleman in Buffy and the Vampire Slayer, and I probably one of his best known roles is one of his earliest, where he played that crescent-headed piano player on the McDonald's commercials.
Oh my gosh!
Yeah, that's what got him started. So he's actually playing the Bye-Bye Man. But the movie's got some well-known people in it, including Faye Dunaway. So, yeah, I was surprised. So it's right now, they keep moving around the release date. So I think at the moment it's coming out in December.
Mm-hmm. I knew
things like that.
I knew Faye Dunaway's ex-husband, Peter Wolf. Well, Peter Wolf from the Jay Giles Band.
Wow.
And I have not seen, I don't know if they're still out there performing, but they were one of my favorite groups, and I had met him a couple of times backstage. We talked about 14 Phenomena. A friend of mine had gone to a concert and taken a photograph of the band, and behind Peter Wolf was, I know, some kind of apparition or something. So we tried to convince him that it was some ghostly phenomenon. I'm not sure whether he actually believed it or not, but we would sit and talk about this. And
Frank Edwards, that's what got me started. It was a battered and dog-eared edition of Stranger Than Science that my mother left on her night table. I think someone gave it to her. I remember it very well because the cover was held on with a piece of silver masking tape, electric duct tape, rather. And I devoured the book, and it's the reason it more or less put me on this path. If Frank Edwards was much more easy to read than Fort. When I finally got to Fort, I was shocked how difficult, how vague or incomprehensible he could sometimes be. And I know he was doing it deliberately, and that he had a very odd sense of humor that came out in his writing.
Yes.
But at the time, it just went right over my head, because I went from Frank Edwards to people like Ivan Sanderson and Bernard Heuvelmans, people like that who were much easier to understand. And of course, John Keel. I still remember the copy of the Mothman Prophecies that was in my public library. That was back when in the library when the section 001 consisted of one book on flying saucers, one copy of the Mothman Prophecies, and a book called the coming age of the computer.
Wow.
I think you went to my local library when I was a kid, Robert. That sounds exactly like it.
I have not been to a library in a long time. I wonder if those old books are still there, and if they have been replaced by anything. What would be the big titles now that you could go into a library and
now a few years ago they were a lot of the abductee books. Whitley Strieber, of course. And you'll still find a few abductee books, but now I've noticed that there seem to be more books on things like alien abduction, pro and con, more books by skeptics.
Yes.
But you'll still find books on ghosts, witchcraft, dreams. Right before the psychology section, there's a chapter in President's Vampire about a mass disappearance in Newark, New Jersey in 1978. That's interesting. Yeah, it happened in 1978, and that's a very urban area.
Mm-hmm.
There were a group of young men who had been hired to move boxes for the day, and they were dropped off at a street corner on a summer evening rather. They broke up. I think there were 7 of them total. They were all around 17 years old. One group went one way, the other group went the other way. I think maybe there was 3 in one group and 4 in the other, and vanished. They've never been seen again. They were erased. The police in Newark have been looking for decades, trying to figure out what happened to them. And the man who hired them to move the boxes that day was the main suspect. He was interviewed many times. Then he was released many times. Finally, he was tried about 2 years ago, and the evidence against him was very thin. So he was released, and that was it. It just has remained utterly mysterious.
Well, I would say it's kind of hard to get rid of 7 bodies. Maybe one or two. You could put in a trunk.
Most people don't realize how difficult it is.
I know. I've spent all weekend a couple of times doing this. as Mr. Creepo, my horror movie. Persona. Yes.
For example, one of the most efficient. Well, people think if you're going to get rid of a body, you burn it. But keep in mind, a human body is a great big bag of water. Try burning it. It's not easy. No. The limbs might curl up and it'll look awful, but it won't even touch the internal organs because they're all water. So this has just gone on as one of the local mysteries. The police have checked every time there was a mass death, for example, at Jonestown. They checked to see if they were among the men who died at Jonestown. They checked to see if they were among Jeffrey Dahmer's victims. They looked for years and years. They've even called in psychics. In fact, one of the investigations was done on the recommendation of a psychic. So they never let it go, but the story it's very little known and remains completely unsolved.
It reminds me somewhat of the smiley face murders. I mean, not the smiley face murders don't happen in mass. It's just like one young man at a time. But you've been seeing these cases all across the country. Where generally it's a guy like at a bar with friends. He'll step outside for a smoke and then just disappear. And then they'll find him days, weeks, months later floating in a nearby river. And go ahead. Go ahead, Webster.
I'm always interested in the mass disappearances because they are just so incomprehensible, which is why I love when they find a car under a bridge that's been there for 30 years in the water. and they'll drag it out and they'll find a few bones and they'll realize, these 5 teenagers that disappeared back in 1970, this is what happened to them.
Here
They drove off the bridge, and the river never went low enough for the bridge to be exposed. And here it is. That's happened a few times in the last few years that they found these cars.
You know, Tim, we've talked about a case on the air here where I think was it Christmas Eve, where these a house was set on fire, or fireballs landed on the roof of the house, and what was it, 7 or 8 children disappeared?
Right. Yeah, it was in Tennessee.
West Virginia, I think. I think West Virginia.
Was it West Virginia? Okay, yeah. And it was like Christmas, and the mother remembered hearing something striking the roof and rolling off, and then just a short while later, the house was on fire, and a couple of the children made it out, but then the others just vanished. They couldn't, as you were saying, Robert. It's even in a house fire. There's always, if there are humans, victims inside, you will find their remains. I mean, they will not burn up completely where they're just ashes. And these children were never found. And the parents always suspected that something else had happened to them.
I have a book called West Virginia Unsolved Murders right in front of me, and the name of the family was, excuse me just one second. The picture, they've got the pictures on the back, and it was Christmas Eve 1945. There were 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There were 5 children, one of whom the family believed survived and appeared a few years later.
Robert, we were talking during our break, and I was asking about how frustrating it can be with newspaper reports, and how a lot of times you'll run across an interesting story, but then there's no follow-up on what may have happened down the line. And you made an interesting comment about newspaper hoaxes. Do you want to get into that a little bit?
Sure. Yeah. One of the most famous newspaper hoaxes was about 1835, when there were reports that astronomers were seeing bizarre creatures living on the moon. And that kind of got the whole newspaper hoax thing started. People realized that on a slow news day, or when you had to get sales going, you could just invent an outrageous story and sell a lot of papers. And some of these have become classics. Some of them are stories that people are still arguing about. For example, the Aurora spaceman who supposedly crashed into a windmill in Texas. There are reports of monsters that some of which are still being seen, but supposedly began as newspaper hoaxes. At this point, I think I'm going to be ending all of my books with a chapter on stories that either didn't pan out or turned out to be hoaxes.
Hey, Robert, how about the flying man over Coney Island?
That's a famous one. A friend of mine looked into that, and he dissected that. He took it apart piece by piece by piece, and it is a hoax.
Boo.
Yeah, I know. But keep in mind that a lot of that stuff is what attracts us to it in the first place. We really shouldn't. I know that there are people involved in the paranormal who despise hoaxes. They say, for example, when you're talking about cryptozoology, that it puts cryptozoology will never be taken seriously as long as people keep finding Bigfoot suits in beer freezers. But the fact of the matter is, it's not taken that seriously anyway. So I know some of my best friends are cryptozoologists, and they take it very seriously. Yeah. They are serious investigators. They are scientists. They know anatomy, zoology. They're serious. But there's also a lot of other stuff involved. Folklore, hoaxing, just a degree of fun that it's a part of it that can't be discounted, and to my mind, it's often very revealing about about where cryptozoology is, for example, in society right now, that somebody will stick a Bigfoot suit in a beer freezer, and it will become a national story. Well, what does that say about us right now?
It says that somebody ought to come up with a Bigfoot beer.
Actually,
there probably is, right? Yeah.
They also have Bigfoot wine, and I think Bigfoot ale.
Yeah, Florida has skunk ape beer.
You don't want
that's
skunk
got to. No, that doesn't sound too. Although some of the wine some of the cheap wine that I've drank over the years must be related.
I mean, my first book, The President's Vampire, turned out to be a hoax. The story which I found in one of Charles Swartz's books was that a sailor on a whaling ship began to kill and drink the blood of fellow sailors. So he was put in chains, taken back to Boston, put on trial, and that was more or less where the story ended. Well, after some really deep research, I even found the ship's log from the day that the murder happened. It turned out that the story was completely wrong. He wasn't a vampire. He was a ship's cook who'd gotten into an argument with a sailor over the quality of the food, stabbed him. He was taken back to Boston, put on trial. He was sentenced to hang, but President Andrew Johnson commuted his sentence because he was clearly insane. In fact, when doing the research, I found out, for example, that sailors used to be able to pay their lawyers with a barrel of whale oil, which I didn't know. But he ended up being sent to a prison where he supposedly drank the blood of more inmates. That didn't happen either. And he ended up in St. Elizabeth's Mental Hospital in Washington, D.C., where I found a bunch of letters that he wrote. And as time went on, he clearly became crazier and crazier and crazier. But he wasn't a vampire. It never happened. But you'll find it in almost any collection of real-life vampires.
You know, of all the paranormal denizens of the dark side, why is it, Robert, that you think vampires seem to be the one that most people are titillated and fascinated by?
They're sexy. At least the Hollywood version of it is sexy. The folklore version of it is not sexy at all.
Oh, definitely not.
In fact, it's repulsive. But the way they've been translated in literature and film makes them very erotic. In fact, there's a section of Dracula where Jonathan Harker is being attacked by Dracula's 3 wives that is pretty heavy reading for a 19th century book. It's pretty erotic. And I think that's always been a subtext of the vampire legend, at least the modern form of it. Again, the traditional folk version of it, and when you get out of Western culture and you go to Asian cultures, the vampires are even more disgusting.
What do they do?
Oh, there's this one called the Penanggalan that appears in Indonesia and in countries in that area. And what it is a witch whose head separates from the body. And as her head flies out of the body, all the intestines and internal organs stay on. So she's flying through the air, dragging her intestines behind her, and feeding on the blood of children and women. So the way you get rid of her is you put thorn branches around your window because she's afraid of getting her intestines caught on them.
Oh, lovely.
Very nice.
Lovely. Oh, I like that.
Well, also, when you look at 19th century mysticism and early 20th century mysticism, you'll also find many references to psychic vampires. That is, people who somehow have this ability, according to the mystics, the people that have this ability to take energy from others and bring it into themselves. Dion Fortune writes about it in some of her books and gives ideas on how to cope with it.
You know,
some of my relatives might fit into that.
Years ago, when I was director of the New York School of Occult Arts and Sciences, which is one of the first metaphysical centers in the country, ran from the late 60s to the mid 70s, we had a lot of people coming in. I would say, let's say, off the street, through ads. They came in to buy books and Ouija boards and stuff like that, and that's how I became, I think, familiar with the psychic vampire, and probably one of the reasons that I never got into the occult retail business, because I discovered that a very high percentage of the people who claimed that they came for knowledge were not coming for knowledge. They were coming to withdraw energy from us or from the speakers, and not give anything in return. It's a very, very, very unusual type of a thing, and I don't think unless you have constant contact with the public, most people realize that it exists. But it can be frightening.
Well, I can't speak for that because I have had very little contact with the public. I generally stay at home and write. But I have spent time with psychics, and they are utterly exhausting. I'm not saying that they're sucking on my energy or anything like that, but I find that there's something about being around them that saps me and leaves me utterly exhausted. Which is one of the reasons why I don't have much to do with them anymore.
Well, some teleport. Well, I know Tim has done some research on teleportation out there in Indiana. Did you not attend or do an investigation in a house where objects were falling from the ceiling?
Oh yes, yeah. Well, rocks. It was a house that had kind of a. I hate to say mundane, but it really was. It was kind of just like a mundane poltergeist activity. And while I was there talking to the people, that there was it's hard to describe. It was like a crash or a boom. But some kind of loud noise shook the house, and then all of a sudden, like small rocks started falling from the ceiling, just in one location, just kind of almost right in the middle of the ceiling, and they were just like little white limestone gravel rocks, and in fact, they had their driveway was full of them, and you really couldn't tell the difference. It looked like that maybe they had been scooped out from that driveway. But you were talking about cats. I do think that cats have the ability to teleport somehow from one place to the other. Because I remember as a kid, I had a friend who had a Siamese cat that they would put it outside and it would be back inside in just a few minutes, and they never could figure out how he was finding his way in, but he always managed to. It was kind of bizarre.
Hey, Robert, do you remember
Yes.
some of the early cases that they've been mentioned in the written up in the 14 Times, where people's homes were continuously pelted by rocks? I know
that's one of the classic poltergeist phenomenon.
Yes.
In fact, it even has a Greek name. They call it lithobolia. For rock
right.
throwing, yeah. It's in fact, when Tim was talking about the rocks that were just dropping into the house, I wondered, for example, were they falling in a straight path? Were they warm? Because for some reason, rock falls during poltergeist are sometimes warm.
Yes to both.
That's right. Yeah.
Yes to both.
And did that also, if it happened at night, were they cool because it's cool outside, or were they?
No, well, it was early evening. The sun was in the process of setting, but hadn't quite set yet. It was like around August, and it was fairly warm outside. But yes, the rocks they fell in just straight down and onto the carpeting, and they didn't bounce or anything like that. But it was carpeting with padding in it, so they would have bounced anyway.
Was there the classic poltergeist child there?
There were two of them. There was an older girl who was about 12, and then she had a younger brother who was 10. And they had just recently moved in with their grandparents because both of their parents had been sent to jail
Wow,
for various
this
things.
this is a classic poltergeist setup.
It really was. Well, the
Puberty, a family under a lot of stress. That's all the ingredients.
well the really bizarre part, and I've talked about this before.
Strange from here.
Oh yeah, and I got this from Ivan T. Sanderson, who did the same thing. And I took out a Sharpie and I marked the rocks with a big X, and then I took them out the back door, and there was a cornfield behind the house, and I tossed them all as far as I could into the cornfield. Came back in, sat down, and almost immediately they came back.
That's classic.
Same pattern, dropping from the ceiling. And then onto the floor.
Were the kids present? Were they in the house?
They were in the house, but they were in their bedroom down the hallway, which I was situated where I could see them down the hallway in the room, because the hallway came off from the living room, and then their room was the last room down the hallway, and I could see them. They were sitting on the bed playing a game.
Mm-hmm.
And then, go ahead.
I'm just, that is just, it's like you're ticking off every box on the classic poltergeist checklist.
Well, and the odd thing about it is that after that incident, the couple, I kept in touch somewhat. They told me that after that evening, then the poltergeist activity just basically stopped. There was a few more minor incidents, but it just basically then went away. It was like all the energy had been used.
Mm-hmm. Don't know your own strength there, Tim.
Robert, what about you? I mean, do you have any favorite paranormal incidents of your own that you've either experienced or researched extensively?
Well, I've got some stories. Most of them are old historical stories that I just very frustratingly they just dried up. But I think when you keep doing this long enough, you get hints of what might explain it. For example, I have this one story from 19th century Maine of this family that went out to their barn and discovered that their cow had dried up. And they were starting to get worried because the cow was not giving milk. And it turned out that a man was hiding in their barn. He was sleeping in the hay, and he was living off the cow's milk and eating tallow candles. But he had no feet. They had been crudely chopped off, and somehow he had ended up at this family's barn. No one knows where he came from. He never spoke. And he ended up being put into the local poorhouse, where supposedly he was put into a sort of an outdoor cage in the summer where they aired him out. They never learned anything else about him. Now, I wrote to the local historical society. I was never able to find out anything precise. And the only thing I can think of, and this was just something I happened to come across, was that it might be a newspaper story based on another story from Canada, where a man without any feet just showed up. But he's pretty well documented. I have him in my filing cabinet. I have the story in my filing cabinet, but I haven't really looked into it because it's Canadian, and I try to concentrate on American stories. This man with no legs, though, that bothered me because if the story was true, again, there was this question of how did he get there? Who left him there? Did he do it himself? People do bizarre things. Mm-hmm. I mean, I've got clippings of. I have a bizarre suicide folder of people that killed themselves by pounding a nail into their heart. Mm-hmm. People that killed themselves. Yeah, I have this one of somebody who took a hard hat and he put rifle cartridges all around it, and then put electrical he put electrical contacts onto the cartridges, and he killed himself by simultaneously shooting something like 9 shotgun cartridges into his head.
Wow.
So I mean, the things people can do to themselves are astonishing.
Mm.
Yeah, in fact, I think there's going to be a chapter in my next book dedicated to people that took the line from Matthew 18 about if your eye offends thee, pluck it out. If thy hand offends thee. These people took the admonition way too literally.
Yeah.
And I think I'm going to do a chapter on them in the next book.
Interesting.
Tentatively titled The Matthew Mutilators. Because it's the book of Matthew.
Robert, what was the last article you wrote for 14 Times about?
It was about a man named Benny Evangelist who was found with his head chopped off, sitting at his desk. He was sitting at his desk. His head was on the floor. And his family was all murdered upstairs. And the police were never able to find out who did it. But they came up with this idea that he practiced a form of Pennsylvania folk witchcraft called
Powwow.
Powwow, right?
We have a book. It's the Book of Powwows. I guess it's an old. Yeah. It's an old. It's mainly weird treatments for animals and things like that.
He came from Italy, and he worked on the railroad in York County, Pennsylvania for a few years. And for some reason, they decided that he was practicing powwow, although he does seem to have been the local sorcerer. He was like the neighborhood witch who gave out love potions and helped people find people, things like that. But this mysterious death led to them investigating his house, and they discovered these bizarre life-size dummies down in his basement. They discovered the book he wrote, which was The Oldest History of the World as Discovered by Psychic Science, which is a book that you really have to try to plow through one day. It is so strange. It was supposedly visions that he experienced every night for 3 hours over a period of 20 years.
Hey, if it's in public domain, we'll put a nice new cover on it, change the title, and publish it.
So, Robert, I wanted to ask you about. You said your most recent book is Mrs. Wakeman versus the Antichrist.
Yes.
I love that title. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that one? That's a great title.
Well, it all got started when I was watching a documentary called On the Manson Family. And one of the women that they were talking to said that the Manson family was the first real cult in America, and the Tate LaBianca murders were the first real cult murders. And I said, no, that can't be right. So I started looking into 19th century cults, and I found several that committed murders. Some that could even be called human sacrifices. But one that stuck in my mind was Mrs. Wakeman, who had a small cult in Connecticut. And it was in the shadow of Yale was the way they kept putting it in the newspapers at the time. But she believed that she was being tormented by the Antichrist, which would jump from person to person. Usually whoever she disliked at the time would become the new home of the Antichrist, and he would send magical things to torment her. Well, one of her own followers eventually became possessed by the Antichrist, and he was murdered by her other followers because they thought that he was magically killing Mrs. Wakeman, who was the Messiah and the Savior of the world. Right after he was murdered, it was on Christmas 1850, I believe. Another one of her sort of semi-followers, somebody who regularly attended her meetings, he went out and murdered two old men with an axe, chopping their heads off. So again, the idea that the idea that Tate LaBianca was the first cult murder in the United States was just very, very wrong. I have a lot of them that we could bring up. So it ended up being called Mrs. Wakeman versus the Antichrist, and people do seem to like that title.
It is good. We received it from your publicist.
Oh, great, great. Did you have a chance to look at some of the other stories?
Actually, no, not yet. We receive about 6 or 7 books a week.
Sure.
And
sure.
Having to do my own work, it's difficult to read a stop sign. Never mind.
Of course. One of the most popular has actually been on people that commit suicide by building guillotines and chopping their own heads off.
I have to admire the enterprise.
Well, it's funny because as nearly as I can tell, they're almost always men, with a few exceptions, but they're almost always men, and they're usually engineers or inventors, and they seem to really enjoy putting together a quality guillotine that takes their head off. The best one though was a man named Moon, who out in Lafayette, Indiana, built a big hinged axe in a hotel room and stuck his head into a box that had some chloroform-soaked cotton in it, and he suspended the axe. The axe was hinged to the floor, and he suspended it with a cord and put a candle next to the cord. So when the candle burned down, it burnt through the cord, released the axe, and chopped his head off while he was stupefied by the chloroform.
I could just hear housekeeping.
Well, the poor thing, some poor maid. She was about 13 years old. She had just started a week before, and she's the one who found him.
Of course.
Oh, my ears are whiskey.
Yeah.
Gosh, must have been a graduate of Purdue.
Well, she actually ended up staying at the hotel for the next 40 years or so. So I guess she figured that once she'd seen that, everything else was going to be downhill.
Yep.
You would hope so.
Right. Nothing's going to top that.
I don't know. I mean, that sounds like a case that I researched for quite a while when I was still in the news business of up in the region, as they call it, the Chicago, northern Indiana area of a guy who allegedly committed suicide by beating himself in the head with a hammer.
Well, I can certainly believe it. I mean, there was another man, a German immigrant in Brooklyn, who tried building a homemade guillotine with an axe, but he couldn't get it to work. So he finally just took the axe and smacked himself right in the face with it.
Oh.
Yeah.
Well, I think this would make a wonderful TV series.
That's about where they are right now. Yes.
Or a movie.
Or a reality show.
Yeah. Well.
So it wasn't just people that built guillotines either. There were men I have one case of a man who managed to slice his own head off with a straight razor.
Ouch.
Yeah, I don't know.
I do that about once a week. I don't know.
How could you do that?
I honestly don't know. I figure that he either had a very thin neck and it was a very long razor, and he just lucked out. That somehow, it was not... back in the days when men shaved with straight razors, it was not unusual to commit suicide by cutting your throat with a razor.
Right,
I figure what he did was he tried cutting his throat with a razor and just went a little too deep and somehow just managed to get through the vertebra. They found the headless body, but he must have done it on a hill or something because the head rolled away and they didn't find it for another few weeks.
I always worry when I go to a bar, get my hair done, and then they want to trim the sideburns and stuff, to let somebody go wild with a straight razor like that. It's just...
Well, I faced that before the wedding last week.
Suddenly they'll remember some slight that happened years ago or something. It's...
Well, I think there was a Babylonian king who didn't like anyone near his hair with a razor, so he always had his hair trimmed with a hot coal.
To each their own.
Exactly.
I've heard of people who have constructed just all kinds of interesting devices. I mean, not only, like you said, to take themselves out of this world, but also, and I'll I'll be kind with this, but just generally for more pleasant things.
Well, it's funny you should mention that, because I think there's also going to be a chapter in my next book on autoerotic fatalities.
There you go.
Because, yeah, they ever since which Carradine died that way?
Mm-hmm. David.
Ever since that happened, it's become part of the national conversation. It's not something that's just completely obscure.
We never brought up the subject of UFOs this evening. Robert, have you ever any good UFO cases out your way that you've investigated?
I'll tell you the truth, Tim. I have always avoided UFOs because it is such a big area and so contentious that I never really wanted to dive into it. I've always avoided UFOs, the Kennedy assassination, and anything with the word Illuminati in it.
Well, we're getting close to wrap-up time. I can't believe that. Really? It's the bewitching hour here on the East Coast, which means that we turn into owls? I don't know. What do we turn into, Tim?
Pumpkins?
Yeah, well, that's
Avocados.
Avocados, yeah.
Speak for yourself. Speak for yourself. I'm trying to lose a little weight. But Robert, why don't you tell us about your website? How do people find you?
Sure. The best way to get in touch with me is on Facebook, and my Facebook page is Historian of the Strange. I try to post something odd there every day.
And Tim and I are finishing up on a book on Nazi UFOs as time travel machines, and another book by Maria DeAndrea.
You've been listening to Exploring the Bizarre with hosts Timothy Beckley and Tim Swartz. They're taking back the night by jetting non-stop across the cosmos in search of the truly bizarre and totally unexplained, with you as their co-pilot. Thursday nights at 7 p.m. Pacific, 10 p.m. Eastern, on the KCOR Digital Radio Network. For more information on Exploring the Bizarre and hosts Timothy Beckley and Tim Swartz, check out their KCOR Digital Radio Network page. Follow their YouTube channel at MRUFO 1100. Exploring the Bizarre.